Hello and welcome again to another program of Searching for Answers. My name is Carolyn Thompson, and on my right is
John Jones, La Sierra University School of Religion.
John Brunt, the Azure Hills Adventist Church.
And in parallel form to John here, Ivan Blazin, Loma Linda University School of Religion.
All right, John Jones. We're going to talk about a blind beggar and how he receives his sight. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, it's an interesting story. We do have it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but the Lucan version here picks up in chapter 18. So we invite our friends to grab Bibles and open up to 18, verse 35 of Luke. This one that I have this evening, for no particular reason, happens to be the New International Version, so we'll pick up with that one and invite you to follow along in your own. In verse 35, we read that as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. And he heard the crowd going by and asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And so he called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. But he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. How embarrassing, huh? This guy yelling.
Yes.
Jesus stopped, ordered the man to be brought to him. And when he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Lord, I want to see, he replied. And Jesus said to him, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God, and when all the people saw it, they also praised God. Interesting little encounter along the way. There are several little marks that I know we'll want to pick up on here in this story. Where should we start?
I'm waiting for you, Ivan.
Okay, well, you're waiting for me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the question is, what is it that grabs us? One of the things that grabs me, and other things may grab you, but is that the disciples who are leading the way, they rebuke him and tell him not to do what he's doing. And in effect, they order him not to do it.
Be quiet.
And then, in just a moment, Jesus orders that they bring the man to him. There's
Stop
two
right
sets
there.
of orders.
Question.
Yeah.
Why did Jesus say, bring the man to me? Why didn't he go to the man?
Well, it's like, let the children come unto me, you know.
Isn't he good?
Well,
He is so good.
this is the kind of story you can preach from, you know.
Yeah.
Let the people
yeah.
come to Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's, we can talk for quite a while about coming to Jesus. And he obviously is available, and he's asking that we come. In this story. It's by invitation that we come. We don't just come of our own wills, but it's by invitation.
How did he know Jesus was the son of David?
That is, now you really asked a very interesting question, because to say that, Son of David, this is in effect a messianic, a title for the Messiah.
So he
Son
has a little
of David.
background of who Jesus is. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he must have heard that Jesus was not only passing by, but that he was someone who healed people and so on. And this is why he's so insistent. This is my chance. This is my opportunity. So he begins to shout. I mean, he has heard things that lead him to shout. There's hope here, you know.
It is interesting that these people who come to Jesus will call him Son of David, have this background. It sounds like they've done homework. It's even more surprising, I think, over in Matthew 15, where the Canaanite woman, who isn't even a Jew, comes and calls him Son of David.
Not Son of Man, Son of David. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Well, at the cross, since we're doing this, I'll go over to Mark now. At the cross, it is a Roman centurion who says, truly, this was the Son of God. So people who you wouldn't think would recognize him, and even a blind man who can't even see him, they're crying out. That must tell us something, that people who we don't maybe esteem very much, like a blind man, I mean, he must have done something wrong, right? They are able to somehow recognize, to sense who Jesus is. And maybe some of the educated, they're unable to do this.
Apparently, he doesn't need much explanation. The one sentence that he gets when he says, hey, 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 what's going on? Is simply, it's Jesus of Nazareth passing by. And that is already all the explanation he needs. Apparently, the word is out that here is someone special.
Yeah, absolutely.
May not know it all, but something that he's heard that's already in the air, and he's able to act on that.
Yeah, he must have known something because he didn't say, son of Joseph.
Yeah, right. Or Jesus. Jesus. I mean, he's from Nazareth, but who's that? You know.
Who is that?
Right,
That's right.
It's also interesting that we have here that Jesus is approaching Jericho. And in the next story, in chapter 19, verse 1, Jesus goes on into Jericho. And so the story carries forward. Interestingly, and in Luke, Jesus stays overnight in Jericho in town with Zacchaeus. But in Mark, we have the idea that Jesus is approaching Jericho, and as he's coming out, he encounters this fellow. I think,
Matthew as well.
And Matthew, that's right.
Mark.
Matthew follows Mark on that. Luke doesn't, precisely because the next story is of Jesus staying overnight in Jericho. I think Luke is kind of setting up the narrative here in that way. Clearly, we have an indication of the shaping function that these gospel writers are performing.
Yeah,
they can craft the stories in ways that hang together for their purposes.
In some sense, they are editors.
They are editors.
They edit, and they put, there was a story that circulates, then they put maybe an introduction to the story, and they may put a conclusion to the story. In other words, they frame the story.
That's right.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and they are theological editors because their framing is often clearly designed to lead the reader in a certain direction. And Mark's direction may be different from Matthew's, again from Luke's or John's.
Yeah.
So they
Well,
have their
the only
purposes.
people who are troubled by this are those who say, I have to have absolute exactitude about the historical details. And actually, that's not the major point here. Here's a story about Jesus who heals a blind man. Coming in or coming out of the city, that's not any great moment here at this point.
Except that when we choose it to be.
Yeah, and it fits in with some theological point the evangelist is making.
That's right. But there are folks who want to make their own theological point still today out of it as modern readers, which probably reflects our own kind of mentality more than that of that age. I think it's important to remember and really helpful when we remind ourselves of something that a lady by the name of Ellen White wrote in Volume 1 of Selected Messages, where she says after all of her reminders that we should not criticize the Bible or doubt it, she then says, and I'm quoting word for word, there is not always exact perfect order in the miracles, she says, of Jesus' life, and we could say the other events as well, but that rather they are given as was needed to reveal the spiritual truths.
Yeah, and that's a fine,
That's
helpful
beautiful.
quote.
Isn't it?
Yes.
So she is at peace after all of her dealings with critical scholarship and all. She was very aware of the disparities between the Gospels,
Well,
and yet the answer, the explanation that she gives is much the same that critical scholars give, namely that this was to bring out certain lessons as they're needed in the church in Luke's time, in Mark's time.
right.
Crafting.
Well, she is an illustration of this herself.
Exactly. Sure.
You know, we have this book by Ellen White, Desire of Ages.
Yes.
It has a certain order to the events. Then there was a precursor to that book. It was in a 4-volume set called The Spirit of Prophecy, where she tells the story of Jesus. And some of the events there are not in the same order as they are in Desire of Ages. That's not
That's not the point.
moment of
No.
great significance. But sometimes by putting a different order, a different thing is taught. For example, the Gospel of Luke, and I think we went over this one time. He has Jesus' first sermon. In his first public activity is this sermon in Nazareth, Luke 4. Matthew and Mark have this incident in Nazareth in a different spot altogether.
Yeah.
But for Luke, he wants to highlight that this story is so powerful, he wants to highlight who Jesus is right at the beginning of his public ministry.
So it sets the scene for the
It
ministry and
sets
what it's all
the-
about.
So it's theologically first,
Yes.
even if not necessarily historically first.
Important.
A writer of a novel will start out with an event that jumps into the middle of a situation, and you're left wondering, what is this about? and then the next chapter or two, he may go back or she may go back and then give a little bit of the background. But it's to grab your attention.
Exactly. Our problem, of course, is that we're quite willing for the writer of the novel to do that, but we have...
We don't cut them any slack, do we?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's because too often our view of what it means for something to be inspired comes from our own preconceptions philosophically rather than letting it come from Scripture so that we actually
And when we
look at
find a
Scripture.
little thing that's a bit different, we say, ha, gotcha. You know, and that's not the way Jesus would have us do. We need to cut people some slack and read everything we can on a certain subject. If there's something that's bothering us, like a surgeon or a internal medicine, I mean, that's why they're trained. They go back and they read all the history about it, and then the updates on medicine and medical work. It's wonderful. So the same is with the Bible.
I do have a book at home that rescues the Bible for a particular view of inspiration by claiming that, yes, as Jesus went into Jericho, as Luke says, he healed a blind man. And that as he came out from Jericho, he healed a blind man. Of course...
Then that fits Matthew, who has two blind men.
Two blind men, that's right. But once you start down that road, you wind up, of course, with Peter betraying Jesus half a dozen times.
That's right.
With two triumphal entries, one on a colt, one on a donkey, and so forth. There's no end to that. The question is, what is it that we're really trying to rescue?
What is the story trying to tell us about
That's
God?
right.
Now, there's the question.
That's right.
And in that regard, there's something that stands out to me.
I interrupted
No,
you.
that's all right.
No, go ahead.
No.
He needs to go ahead. I interrupted him. Go ahead.
I was going to amen you, so I'll do that.
Okay, all right. Well, then I want to tell you a little bit about Jericho. Would you like to know about Jericho?
Sure.
Okay, Jericho was a very wealthy and a very important town. I'm going to set the background for our next story.
Ah, yes.
It lay in the Jordan Valley and commanded both the approach to Jerusalem and the crossings of the river, which gave access to the lands east of the Jordan. It had a great palm forest and world-famous balsam groves, which perfumed the air for miles. Now, its garden of roses were known far and wide. It was known as the City of Palms. Josephus, we all know who Josephus is. He's a historian. Josephus called it a divine region, the fattest in Palestine. The Romans carried its dates and balsam to worldwide trade and fame. Now, what does this mean? It's a wealthy city, right? And when people passed through on their way to another country, they were taxed, right? Taxation here, there, probably a little cheating going on. And so that sets the background for the story we're going to talk about next. Okay.
Can we say one more thing about this one, though, before we go to that one?
No.
Oh, we can't.
Of course.
Last time, Ivan read the passage, and he read it from the New Revised Standard, I believe. And this time, John Jones read it from the New International Version.
Yes.
And what Jesus says to the man is a little different. And I think that it really hits at the heart of what this story is all about and what Luke is trying to say. In the version John read, Jesus says to him, "Receive your sight, your faith has healed you."
That's right.
In the version that Ivan read, it says, "Your faith has saved you." Now, the word for healed that's used here is the word save.
Exactly.
All through the New Testament,
Yeah.
the word for salvation is this word. So which is the right translation? Your faith has healed you, your faith has saved you, and I think that's
right.
exactly the point that
Both
Luke's
right.
making
Yeah.
is both. In fact, you can kind of read the whole story on two levels. The man
That's right.
comes and Jesus says, "What do you want?" And he says, "Well, I want to receive my sight."
Jesus
But the
knew
word,
what he wanted.
sure. But the word can also mean to look up.
Yes.
So you could read this. On the one hand, the man says, I want to receive my sight. And Jesus says, okay, you're healed.
Okay.
But in another way, you could read it, I want to look up. And Jesus says, you're saved. And then he follows Jesus and praises him. And so the story,
So there's a vertical
on one level,
element.
is just the story of a blind man being cured. But on another level, it's the story of all of us finding salvation in Jesus Christ. And Luke is he crafts the story in a beautiful way so that you see both of those.
That's a beautiful story.
Well,
Beautiful
that
story.
interesting?
So then we have, just as the story ends.
Are we going to Jericho?
No, we're almost there.
We're going, remember, they marched around it 7 times.
And then the walls fell down.
Yeah, so he followed him, and then I like it, glorified God. He glorified God, and then when the others saw it, they gave praise to God. It's the same basic thing. So there is this other vertical as well as a horizontal, we might say, dimension to this story.
That's right.
And we're bidden to see a lot in this story. Maybe our eyes need to be open. We're blind to see. We need to see multiple levels.
We do.
There
some
are
of these
multiple levels, and when you study the Bible and you've read something over and over and you go back and you say, oh, I didn't see that the
That's right.
first time. So,
Ivan, you've spoken of the levels, and John, you've spoken of the crafting and shaping of the story. This is 2 ways of saying the same thing. If we read this story with both lenses of our eyeglasses, we see through one lens a story of Jesus in his earthly ministry. Through the other lens, we see the experience of the early church in AD 70 or 80 or whenever we want to say Luke is writing. And it's clear that we have here a paradigm, an example, a reflection of the experience of the early church in John and Luke's own time. The very opening cry, Son of David, have mercy on me, it already sets up a kind of a classic model of the experience of a person, as you have said, John, coming to Jesus, crying for mercy. So much so that we believe the early church in their worship services opened up with that opening prayer,
Really?
Lord, have mercy. In fact, many of our viewers will be familiar with the fact that a high mass in the Catholic tradition still today opens up with that expression classically, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. It's right out of this story. But the story is right out of the church's worship experience. So all of these things about seeing again, looking up, being saved or delivered, and following Jesus and praising him, all of these are little hooks, I think, that both reflect Jesus' own earthly ministry and the experience of the early church under persecution, hardship, and suffering, trying to understand, trying to have their eyes open. And so it still speaks to us today.
Sure, and then to us. I used to tell my students when I taught Gospels, you just can't read the Gospels without trifocals.
Yeah, that's right.
You have to have trifocals because you have to see
Yeah.
the level of Jesus. You have to see the level of the early church.
And for
then
us
you
today.
have to see for us
Well,
today.
and this story certainly has to be an anticipation
I'm
Of-
anticipating.
of when Jesus shortly will be coming into Jerusalem, and the
Yes.
crowds will be saying,
That's right.
Son of David, again. So this is all tied together. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Luke, when he wrote this, wanted everyone to know that the belief of the church was that Jesus is the Son of David. But probably even in a deeper sense than even Judaism understood it.
Yes.
Okay, I think we better move on. And John, I'm going to have you read chapter 19, the first few verses that I read previously, and just continue on a little bit. Okay? John Jones.
Well, let's see how far we get. You blow the whistle on me, okay?
Sure.
And we'll see how we do. Here's chapter 19 now. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector. He was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. And so he ran ahead and climbed up a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up same verb, by the way, and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. And so he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner.
Keep going.
In verse 8, Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save what was lost.
That would have really had a hook, wouldn't it? A barb when he said, this man too is a son of Abraham.
He was Jewish.
Yeah, but he's
Zacchaeus was Jewish, but he was a tax collector.
But he was a traitor,
and he was hated among his people.
And they would not want to call him a son of Abraham.
But he was.
What interests me about this story is, and I know we'll probably have some discussion on this point. When you read this story, it's clear enough. It says he's rich, but it doesn't say he's bad, right?
But he's a sinner.
Well, they say he's a sinner.
Verse 7.
And they could easily say he is a sinner because he worked for Rome. Okay? Now, the question is about this story, is this the story of the forgiveness of a sinner, or is this the story of a vindication of a son of Abraham who was maligned by his countrymen as being a bad fellow because he worked for Rome?
Yes and yes.
Yes, but I also think he must have had some knowledge of Jesus because his conscience was already bothering him, because he all of a sudden said, before he really knew Jesus, that he was going to pay back 4-fold those who he had cheated, and he was going to try and make everything right.
Well, he says, I don't know if his cheating, I mean, the first part, he gives all of his money to the poor. I mean, he gives a good portion. He gives a good portion of his money to the poor. That sounds like a pretty good guy. And it seems like, is that what he was doing characteristically? Is this the future, or is this already? He's been giving his money to the poor.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I don't.
In verse 8, see, they're in the banquet.
You mean he's just starting then?
Yeah, they're in the banquet, and people muttering, he's gone in there, he's in that house with that guy, see? And then, in verse 8, he jumps up. That means he's at the table, see? And his evening with Jesus has so impressed him that he's jumping up at this moment and saying, now, here's what I'm going to do, Lord. Which, of course, contrasts with the rich young ruler who would not give away his money to the poor.